Josh Hasten here, Israel Uncensored, Land of Israel Network at thelandofisrael.com. Thanks so much for joining us. It is the 11th of February, 2018, the 26th of Shvat, 5778, almost the Hebrew month of Adar, and with that brings joy, the holiday of Purim, of course, Rosh Chodesh Adar being this Thursday and Friday. And we are commanded to be happy. We have to be happy, even though the situation here in Israel is a little bit crazy. Got a little bit of a worrisome or hectic weekend, hectic Shabbat here. And, of course, we're talking about the situation in northern Israel. When you hear this broadcast after Monday, the 12th of February, who knows what would have happened or is happening as you are listening to this broadcast, but I'm going to give you an update of what's going on now as I'm speaking to you here on Sunday evening. In just a few minutes, we're going to be speaking to Seth Frantzman, op-ed editor of the Jerusalem Post. He's also a writer for the paper and a columnist. He was in the north, and we'll get to that and I'll explain. He was in the north yesterday, and he saw what was going on firsthand. And if you are not aware, play-by-play from this morning's Jerusalem Post of the day's events. An Iranian drone, which was launched from a Syrian base in the Homs Desert, was identified approaching Israeli airspace about 4 a.m. on Saturday morning, on Shabbat morning. Alarms were sounded in the Golan Heights and in the Jordan Valley. The drone then entered Israel via Jordanian airspace, flying for a minute and a half before it was intercepted by the Israeli Air Force, by an Apache helicopter near the town of Beit Sha'an. So that's how the day started yesterday on Shabbat. Israel identifying the drone as operated by the Iranians via their friends in Syria. So Israel blows up this drone, which was launched somewhere out in the Syrian desert. It crosses into Israel. Israel blows it up. Then after that, you had Israel retaliate for that incident and launch an attack on strategic targets in Syria. As that happened, 2 Israeli crew members were wounded after ejecting from their F-15I aircraft. Apparently, either they recognized that they were in the crosshairs of the anti-aircraft missiles from the Syrians, or some reports indicate that one of the missiles actually struck the tail of that jet. And here, this is unbelievable. The jet was able to fly back into Israeli airspace before both pilots ejected from that aircraft. And initially, there was one pilot listed in very serious condition, another pilot listed lightly wounded after, and you can actually see the video of the pilots coming back down to earth. One of the residents of northern Israel has this on film. I can report to you now today, Sunday afternoon, that the pilot who's in serious condition is now listed in moderate condition. Thank God his situation has improved. He is stabilized. So you had Israel striking Syrian targets, 2 pilots ejecting from their planes, and being taken to a hospital in Haifa. After that happened, all happening here on Shabbat morning, my phone was going crazy. I didn't know exactly what was going on, but I could, the screen flashes on and you see that there are sirens in the north, chaos, don't know exactly what's going on. Following the crash of the jet, Israel carried out a large-scale attack against 12 targets in Syria, including air defense batteries and other Iranian military targets. And that attack also met with anti-aircraft fire, triggering more alarms in the Golan and in northern Israel. So that is where we stand here today on Sunday afternoon. The Prime Minister of the State of Israel warning Tehran, do not test us. As reported by Herb Kanan in today's Jerusalem Post, Israel will continue to defend itself resolutely against infringements on its sovereignty, and Israel will continue to defend itself resolutely against infringements on its sovereignty and Iran's effort to entrench itself militarily in Syria. Israel will continue to defend itself resolutely against infringements on its sovereignty and Iran's efforts to entrench itself militarily in Syria. That the Prime Minister of the State of Israel warning Iran. It's a very tricky situation here with the Russians embedded in Syria, and we're going to ask Seth Frantzman about this as well in just a few minutes. Russia, of course, taking sides with the Syrian regime, with troops on the ground there in Syria, so Israel has to be very careful at the same time as it carries out these self-defense measures. The response, if you have not already heard, I mean, the Russians are calling for calm, and how ironic when you have 500,000-600,000 people dead. At the same time, the United Nations, where have they been over the last 5-6 years, calling for calm on the Israel-Syrian border? I guess no real surprise there that is their response, instead of acknowledging Israel's right to defend itself, and the fact that they have done essentially nothing while 500,000+ people have been killed in that conflict there in Syria. The United States, however, issued a statement saying Israel, quote, Israel is our closest security partner in the region. We fully support Israel's inherent right to defend itself against threats to its territory and its people. Now, take that statement and then imagine if we had the old administration in place there in the U.S. I'm talking about, of course, President Obama and Secretary of State John Kerry and the rest of them. Imagine what the reaction would be out of Washington. So there's a change there. And talking about the hypocrisy of the UN, also reported by Reuters, residents of Israel's south could hear explosions coming from across the border in Sinai as Egypt's Air Force pounded terrorist targets in northern and central parts of the peninsula on Saturday, the second day of an assault to try to crush an insurgency that has killed hundreds of people since 2013. Why isn't the UN calling for quiet on the Egyptian border, or more accurately in Sinai, when Egypt takes necessary measures to defend its citizens? Why is the UN and Russia and everyone else, other than the U.S., I guess, calling for quiet on the Syrian border? You talk about the hypocrisy. There you have it, front and center. So the question is, what's going to be the situation with the North? An analysis by editor-in-chief of the J-Post says, he's calling it, he says the following: the open war with Iran has begun. He says what happened in northern Israel on Saturday is the beginning of the overt and direct war between Israel and Iran. The infiltration and interception of an Iranian drone over Israel, the downing of an Israeli F-16, and Israel's retaliatory strikes against Syrian and Iranian targets, he says, are apparently just the opening scenes of a potentially wider conflict that could erupt if Iran continues trying to fortify its presence in the new Syria. That's Yaakov Katz in this morning's Jerusalem Post. So time will tell what the situation will be in northern Israel. We've had this feeling, and the commentators over the last couple of days and weeks have said, any day now something could happen in the north, and there you have it. So far, that's what you have in northern Israel. We'll see where things go. But usually, and I've told my listeners this many times, usually Sunday is like the quietest news day here in Israel. Nothing going on. You have Shabbat, nothing really making the news. And here you have this entire situation in northern Israel. We'll see how it plays out. But at the same time, there is other news here in the Holy Land. The Indian Prime Minister met with Palestinian Authority head Mahmoud Abbas yesterday and said the following: Arafat was one of the world's greatest leaders. Now, he is an interesting guy, Modi, the Prime Minister there of India. The Prime Minister Netanyahu, of course, visited India several weeks ago, and he got a hero's reception, a rock star's reception there when he visited India. Yet the Indians and Prime Minister Narendra Modi, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, he has a policy whereas he can be completely friendly with Israel and visit Israel, which he did earlier in the year, and then host the Prime Minister of the State of Israel, and then a few days or weeks later can go visit Mahmoud Abbas and have a great relationship with him. And I understand the politics involved, but what I don't understand is laying a wreath on Arafat's grave and visiting the Arafat Museum, whatever that is, and saying that he was one of the greatest leaders of our time. I don't get it. I don't get how he is able to do that with a straight face. And, there's appeasement and there's politics and what have you there in the world of diplomacy and the political realities that we deal with in this world of ours. But there is a gvul, as they say in Hebrew. There is a line, as they say in English, that I believe that the Indian Prime Minister crossed. I don't think you pay your respects and call him one of the greatest leaders ever, the mass murdering terrorist Yasser Arafat. Yet that's what happened here in Israel on Saturday. But of course, switching gears here, the world, as we know, just loves the Palestinians, and as they are called, and will do anything for them. But how ironic, as Khaled Abu Tuame says in an article he just wrote for Gatestone, he asks, and this is also in relation to Syria, he asks, why the need to keep reminding the world of the plight of the Palestinians in Syria, he asks. In other words, he thinks that's an important thing to do, to remind the world about what's going on with those who fled Israel and now their descendants living in Syria. Why is it important to remind the world about them? It is because, he says, the international community and pro-Palestinian groups around the world do not seem to care about the atrocities being committed against the Palestinians in Syria or any Arab country because they were not committed by Israel. In other words, when things happen here in Israel, the world condemns Israel left, right, and center. Every story, every incident involving the Israeli army and the Arabs who live in Judea and Samaria, that is front page headlines all over the world. Yet Khaled Abu Tuame describes the situation for those who call themselves Palestinians who live in Syria, stating that the world doesn't care about them. And what do we learn from this? We learn it has nothing to do with caring about them. It has to do with hating Israel. If Israel isn't part of the story, if they're not involved, if they're not in the news for something that happened or did not happen, if the world can't blame Israel for it, then those Palestinians who are, I'm sure, suffering much greater in Syria than they are in Israel, where so many have jobs and so many are doing better than Arabs or Muslims in any other parts of the Middle East. Yet, because of the fact that the story doesn't involve Israel, it's not on the table. No one cares about the Palestinians in Syria. You see how that works? And I'm just glad that Khaled Abu Tuame is reporting the truth and telling it like it is there in Gatestone. One other BDS-related piece of news before we take a quick break and then go to Seth Frantzman from the Jerusalem Post. Roger Waters, here's BDS, more BDS stuff. Roger Waters is at it again, of course, the rock and roller from the band Pink Floyd. He is now taking to task all those other rock and roll stars who are willing to perform in Israel. So, reported here by Israeli Cool. You should check out that website. Aussie Dave on Israeli Cool talks about how Roger Waters attacks Elton John, Steve Van Zandt, Steven Tyler from Aerosmith, Nick Cave, and the guys at Radiohead. Anybody else who played in Israel was willing to play and perform here in the state of Israel. So there you see where the truth of Roger Waters. I hope that Howard Stern, and if you've heard my show, I believe I've talked about this before, how Howard Stern recently called out several times Roger Waters for his hate of Israel and hate of the Jews. And then Howard Stern went off and on Lorde, criticized, that's Lorde, the singer from, I believe she's from New Zealand, who refused to play Israel. So I hope that Howard Stern has a field day tomorrow on his show, if he's live tomorrow, going after Roger Waters for viciously attacking Elton John, Steven Tyler, and others who are willing to perform in Israel. Let's see how this develops. I hope somebody stands up to Roger Waters and calls him out on this. Somebody of the caliber and of the somebody as popular as Howard Stern to really get the word out there on Roger Waters and his just blatant hatred for Israel, for the Jews. It's so blatant the way he attacks all these other real rock stars, not like Roger Waters. And let's see how this develops. One other, I guess, BDS related story: Ozzy Osbourne, the king of heavy metal himself, he's coming back to Israel scheduled to play, I believe, this summer. He was interviewed about his upcoming concerts, including his trip to Israel, reported here by the J Post. Legendary heavy metal rocker Ozzy Osbourne is excited about his upcoming trip to Israel and doesn't care about any backlash. Osbourne, alongside his wife Sharon, gave a press conference in L.A. the other day discussing his upcoming global farewell tour. I guess this is the last time he's going out on concert. A reporter asked him if his family would be joining him at any part of the trip, and Sharon said that there are certain places, quote, that my kids want to see. Kelly and Jack really want to come to Israel, so they'll be with us in Israel. And then she said apparently she's half Jewish, and she said, quote, we play where we want to play. That's it. So Sharon Osbourne, I'm a new fan of Sharon Osbourne and Ozzy Osbourne for saying they're going to come to Israel. They have no problem playing in Israel. Ozzy chimed in to add that the last time he played in Israel, he said it was a great concert in 2010 when he played in Hayarkon Park. So BDS fail to those trying to convince Ozzy Osbourne and Sharon and the family not to come to Israel. And let's see who's going to stand up for Israel again, once again. Hopefully Howard Stern against Roger Waters and the hate that he spews from time, all the time, rather, against Israel and the Jews. We're going to take a break, come back with Seth Frantzman from the Jerusalem Post. My name is Josh Hasten. This is Israel Uncensored, Land of Israel Network at thelandofisrael.com. Thanks so much for joining us here on this Sunday, 11th of February, 2018. And we will be right back. Do not go away for much, much more on the program.
It's much more real than any reality show. It's much more dramatic than any drama. It's much more funny than any comedy. It's like a game show, but it's no game. It's our lives.
Listen to Inside Israel Today with Gil Hoffman, political correspondent for the Jerusalem Post, every week on thelandofisrael.com.
And we are back. Josh Hasten here, Israel Uncensored, Land of Israel Network at thelandofisrael.com. It is the 11th of February, 2018, the 26th of Shvat, 5778. Thanks for joining us here on the program. Make sure you get in touch with me during the week, Josh at thelandofisrael.com, on Twitter at Josh Hasten, and on Facebook, Joshua Hasten. We've been talking about the situation in northern Israel, and Seth Frantzman, op-ed editor at the Jerusalem Post, he's also a journalist over there, and a columnist. He actually was up in the north over Shabbat, and I saw some of his commentary on the situation up there. He was actually at the site where the F-16, the Israeli plane, landed or crashed, for a better word. He joins us now on the phone. Seth, thanks for joining us here on Israel Uncensored.
Sure. Thank you for having me.
If you can, give us an update, the latest information you have here. We're talking now Sunday afternoon, and by the time the listeners hear this on Monday, who knows what could be happening in the north. But based on what you saw there yesterday and what's going on today, what can you update us with, Seth?
Well, I don't know if there's a lot of update. I mean, I think basically the Israeli government is saying that the Iranians in Syria were struck a severe blow, according to Netanyahu. And also there were reports that the total number of Syrians that were killed in these strikes was 6 people, because these were strikes that were targeting allegedly Iranian bases, some Syrian air defense, different Syrian stuff. But we also know that, a lot of these bases are very sensitive, because you obviously have, Syrian military personnel, you may have Hezbollah there, you have Iranian advisors, and you may even have, in some cases, Russians nearby, because Russia's, obviously involved in Syria, and Israel would not want to harm any of those Russians. So I think they had to be, to some extent, very careful in carrying out all these retaliatory strikes.
Based on what I read in the J Post this morning, they were saying that this was perhaps the most devastating attack that Israel has undertaken against the Syrian target since 1982. Is that the case? I mean, you said 6 people were killed. Is it to that extreme? Did Israel do that much damage from what you know?
I mean, I'm not sure if we know exactly. That is definitely the set. We keep hearing stories like this. Yeah, 1982. It's a complex attack, and something like since 1973. It's the first time an Israel aircraft was shot down since 82. So there's lots of different comparisons floating around. I mean, I'm not sure. We just don't know what we don't know, which is the sense that, for instance, we know that over the last few years, Israel has, I think, struck Syria up to 100 times or perhaps more, according to public information. And there's been a whole series of strikes. So this may be the single worst strike in one day. And I think that's kind of probably what we're looking at, because it was a pretty serious affair to have an Israeli F-16 that basically was shot down. And the fact that the Iranians thought they could drive a drone into Israel airspace, obviously, is the Iranians feeling that they're not being deterred.
At the same time, you mentioned the Russians there, of course, playing a big role in Syria in the war that they've had over the last, what is it now, 5-6 years. If you can describe the differences in the reaction from the Russians on one hand, and then on the Americans on the other hand. I mean, essentially, the Russians called for quiet, while the Americans, on the other hand, said that Israel has the right to defend itself. We're seeing there a discrepancy in reactions between Russians and as well as the United Nations, and then the Americans, perhaps something that we would not have seen under President Obama. If you can comment on the differences there in terms of the attitude towards what Israel had to do yesterday.
Well, I mean, given the fact that Russia is actually, the Syrian regime's closest ally, historically and today, actually the fact that their remarks have been, relatively tepid, it would seem, not, as far as I know, not deep condemnation of Israel. Actually, it's a kind of a positive thing for Israel. It means that the line of communications with Moscow seems to be working. Russia kind of understands that the Iranians have a different agenda in Syria than the Russians do. The Iranians want to use Syria as a base to mess with Israel. Russia wants to use to use Syria as a base to defend the Syrian regime, but not to cause the Syrian regime to get involved in all sorts of other wars. So I think, the Russians kind of understand what the weird game that's taking place in the South. Obviously, the United States, I think, respects and supports Israel's right to defend itself if an enemy drone is flying into Israel. So that's, I think, kind of expected. And of course, the Syrian regime would be, condemning Israel, whatever, and the Iranians will condemn Israel. And the UN, it's interesting that the UN, which didn't seem to notice, 600,000 Syrians being killed, is now very, very worried about trying to have calm or de-escalation or whatever.
Yeah, pretty hypocritical of them. You yesterday you were up in the north. I guess you were there for the weekend for Shabbat, and all hell broke loose. I guess up there you were at the site of the plane crash, the F-16I, which was shot down, and thank God managed to come back to Israel, and the pilot's ejected. And by the way, reports I saw this afternoon is one of the Israeli pilots who was initially labeled as being in serious condition. He's now upgraded to stable and more moderate condition. But what was the mood amongst the Israeli civilians, the Israeli population up there? I understand over 100,000 Israelis went to the national parks yesterday. What did you see from the people there in terms of their resiliency, or perhaps maybe they were more worried? What was your impression actually being up there in the north yesterday?
It seemed to me basically that everything was totally normal. I mean, our driving around, obviously some people are enjoying, Shabbat, so they don't even know what's happening. But, lots of people are doing other things. They're not observant, so they're just going on hikes and stuff. From what we could tell, everyone was basically doing their normal routine. And, these areas in northern Israel suffered the 2006 war with Lebanon. I think these, people basically understand you have to do your normal life. You can't be scared. And if the time comes when war breaks out, then of course you'll go to the bomb shelter, and some of those people will be called up for the reserve duty. So my feeling was basically nothing really, but the tensions, despite the tensions on the radio, the tensions in terms of daily life were quite low. And in fact, this morning, that kind of bears out what I saw on the ground, which is that the National Parks Authority said that huge numbers of people visited the north yesterday. Many people even went up to the Golan.
Right. And did you yourself have to, at any point, run for shelter with the sirens, or you weren't that far north?
No, we were in the Krayot next to Haifa, and the closest sirens to us were in Akko and Kfar Masaryk, which is, just up the coast. So, we were about 16 kilometers from where the F-16 crashed, which is really pretty close. But we didn't hear any sirens. I just woke up and looked at my phone, and I saw that the Tseva Dome, or the red alert thing, had been sounding since, earlier in the morning. But and my wife said, "Yeah, did you see what's happening?" And I said, "Okay, I better go look."
Yeah, I guess I mean I wasn't in the north, but I was in the same boat, getting the buzzes on my silenced cell phone all Shabbat morning, so I knew something was going on, and of course now we have an escalation. Last question, Seth: what can we expect? I know you're not a fortune teller, but what can we expect in the days and weeks ahead? The Prime Minister is warning Tehran, "Do not test us." What do you imagine we'll see? Perhaps tonight, tomorrow night, in the weeks ahead? What do you imagine is going to happen on the northern front in the near future?
I mean, my sense is that not much, because it's not really in Iran's interest, I don't think, to start a massive war up there that could destabilize the Syrian regime, which obviously Iran would like to keep in power so that Iran can keep basing itself there. Hezbollah has its own agenda. But Hezbollah also knows that, it would destabilize the region. And obviously the U.S. Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, is traveling there, so that worries them. Russia, of course, is playing a restraining role to restrain the Syrian regime, or probably try to encourage the Iranians not to mess around. And certainly it's not in Israel's interest to have a huge war. I mean, Israel wants to just have deterrence. So given all those factors, things that are against the war, one would hope that the quiet will stay for a bit.
Yeah, it's always good when there's a little quiet here in Israel, which is pretty rare. I mean, I'm not talking about war, whatever that means these days, what a war actually is, but there's always something going on here in Israel, and hopefully, as you said, hopefully it'll just be a one-off, and things will remain relatively quiet for our brethren in the north and the people down south as well, because Hamas is potentially, or at least they say they're on high alert now, whatever that means, for potential conflict there with Israel. But I want to thank you so much for your time. Seth Frantzman, op-ed editor, columnist, and journalist for the Jerusalem Post, whose Sabbath was disturbed yesterday, and he had to spring into action as a result of the situation up there. So I want to thank you for your time, and keep up the good work over there at the paper.
Okay, thank you. Bye.
Have a great week. Thanks so much. And that's going to do it for another edition of Israel Uncensored here. I am Josh Hasten. Get in touch with me during the week. Josh@thelandofisrael.com is my email. On Facebook, it's Joshua Hasten. On Twitter, @Josh Hasten. And, of course, we are going to bring you as much information as we can here on the Land of Israel Network as the week goes ahead. And I'm sure you don't want to miss the other hosts the rest of the week to get the latest update on the situation in the north and everything else going on here in the Land of Israel. Thanks so much to Benjamin Bresky for all the work he does to make sure these broadcasts get out, and everyone else affiliated with the network. I'm Josh Hasten, and most importantly, between now and when we talk again next week, everybody out there in the wonderful world of ours, be safe. Shalom, shalom from Gush Etzion, Israel.
We as a people? Who are we as a nation? What does it mean to be a Jew in the land of Israel, as a Jew in Judea? What is our message to the world? We're finally back in our land, and we get to ask these questions.
Be'ezrat Hashem, we're going to make Judea and Samaria an issue for the entire world, to know that the Jews have a place in the world.
Israel Inspired with Ari Abramowitz and Jeremy Gimpel on the Land of Israel Network at thelandofisrael.com.